Hello and welcome, Katie here. Thanks so much for stopping by. I'm excited to be back with another project for Imagine Crafts. And today I've got a really fun technique for you. Today's video is a little bit longer, but we're going to focus more on the technique. I am not the first to bring this to you. Marian Emberson was, but I thought it was worth repeating, and I actually have a little tip for you as we go through the video. So what I'm using is some MBoss embossing powder from Imagine Crafts. You can use any embossing powder that you have. What you really need for this technique is the parchment paper, or baking paper as it's known in some parts of the world. Do not use wax paper for this technique. You need some flexible spatulas. This one is a cake decorator frosting spreader. So any thin spatula is going to work. And then you need either a heat gun or an iron, a household iron. Well, I guess it could be any iron. Even your little Cricut irons, you can do. And the Cricut presses and things like that. So on the parchment paper, I just showed you that I cut the parchment paper on the 14-inch side, or close to 14-inch side. So we basically have a 5x7 piece, and it was scored already, so it made it perfect. And I've got two pieces that I can bounce back and forth between. But really, these we're going to call these embossing skins, and they peel off really nicely off the parchment paper, so you can reuse these things over and over and over again. Because there's not much residue that's left behind. So Marian in her video did little piles of color. These are the colors that I have. I don't have a ton of the MBoss Embossing Powders. So use what you have. But I had blues and purples and silvers and whites. So that's what I'm using today. But she made little piles and then used her heat gun to melt them and create the skins. And I'm using an iron today, but I thought I'll sprinkle. I'd started off with the piles, but then I thought, why not sprinkle it? How much, sometimes you want to figure out how much embossing powder do you really need, because while embossing powder lasts forever, it's not a lifetime thing. But you don't want to waste it all in one project, right? So I started sprinkling. Now the key here is once you've melted your embossing powder, you need to let it dry. You need to let it cool. I'm sorry. It's got to be cool to the touch before you pull that parchment open. And look at that. Isn't that pretty? Take your flexible spatula, shimmy it under to release it from the parchment paper on that side, and you've got a nice thin skinned background. Isn't that cool? I just think that's the neatest thing. They're really delicate, so just be careful. They're very thin. You can see some of the holes, especially on the edges. So just be careful with them. I wouldn't necessarily make a ton of these. I am showing several examples of the skins, but I only make one of them into a card today. But because they're thin, I'm not sure how you'd store them to keep them safe. Maybe tuck them in a parchment paper and, on a shelf by themselves. But I wouldn't make tons of these, like die cuts and things, because they're delicate. The other thing I want to mention between the heat gun and the iron, Marian used a heat gun. I can't remember. I think she did use an iron too, but she focused more on the heat gun. And so what she did was she did the same process. She folded the parchment paper over, and then she heated the embossing powder up with the heat gun, and then bounced it up and down on top of that parchment paper and that embossing powder. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's what she did. The other thing is that these melt matte, so there's no shine to them. So if you want shine, you want to, once this cools, open it up, take your heat gun and heat it up again, and it's going to bring back some of that shine. I didn't do that in today's video. I just used the iron, and I used another product from Imagine to add some shimmer and some gloss and shine. But you can use your heat gun, even if you're using your iron, to bring back that shine once you've melted it with the iron. So super thin. The other thing, while we're here with those holes in that particular skin, is that if you melt it, whether you've melted it with your heat gun or you've melted it with your iron, and then you open up your parchment paper and you want to bring that shine back with your heat gun, you're going to get more holes. For some reason, it brings on more holes to your skin. So that's just something to keep in mind too. So just some blues and silvers. We're going to do this one. I'm trying to think. I want to make sure I hit everything as far as technique goes and things that you can do. So here we're going to let this cool. Now, what's awesome is you get two different backgrounds. So maybe you don't like the way the front of this looks, right? Because I use quite a bit of silver on this one. But you flip it over and you got a totally different look. Oh, that's what I wanted to mention. Die cutting. You can die cut this, okay? What you want to do is you've got your skin, put a piece of parchment paper over the top of that, then put your die on top of the parchment paper. So you've got a die, your parchment paper, and your skin, your embossing skin. The parchment paper is going to protect your skin from the die so that it will come out. It'll come apart. If you just die cut your embossing skin with no protection, your embossing skin is going to get stuck within the die, and you're going to ruin it because it's thin, it's delicate. So here I'm showing you that if you don't let the embossing cool and you pull open your parchment paper, you can get that smeared look, and you have two skins. But again, they're really thin and delicate, so that's just something to keep in mind if you want to go for that look. Now, here is where I'm going to show you the creative medium in shimmer. This is what I used to add a little bit of sparkle to the background, to add a little bit of shine back. I wouldn't say that it stiffens up the embossing skin because it still stays pretty flexible, but it does add some gloss and shine and some shimmer with the sparkle that's in the creative medium. So here I'm just showing you what that looks like a little bit more up close. Again, they're really delicate, so just be careful with those edges. But here is our purple and white, our amethyst and white embossing powder. And for all the white, I used iridescent opaque. So you're not going to have that shimmer and shine because they melt matte. So I would recommend not wasting your sparkly embossing powders for this technique and just use your flat colors. This is the background that we're going to use for today's card, and it makes the most amazing galaxy background, I think. So we're using sapphire, icy blue, amethyst, and the iridescent opaque. I just stuck with the iridescent opaque instead of wasting my white embossing powder because I don't have a ton of that left. Now, one thing I want to mention is the old embossing powders that you have. Use them for this. Don't let those go to waste, even though you can't emboss them for a normal embossing project. This technique would be great for that because you're not looking for the shine, and they're just going to melt together, which is all you're really looking for. And then your older embossing powders that don't work like they should don't go to waste. So isn't that cool? I really love that background. Excuse me, I had to cough. And so now we're going to peel this away, and it's really super thin, very delicate. And in fact, the more you spread your iron out and thin it out, the thinner your skin is going to be. So it's important that you just be mindful of that. And of course, how much embossing powder you use. What I like about this is you don't have to use a ton of embossing powders to get a really cool result. So you're not wasting anything. And every color combination that you use, even if you use the same, are not going to give exactly the same results. So you get some pretty cool backgrounds, even though you might use the same colors. So here I'm adding the creative medium, and I did tear this. You can see how thin that was, but I was going to tear it anyway, because I didn't want that all on one background for the card design that I had in my mind. But I do have some water on that paintbrush there, dipping into the creative medium. It's not a dripping wet paintbrush, but the bristles are wet, and that way it allows that creative medium, which is like a glue, to spread a lot easier. Now the Love You comes from, that's a sentiment I used, is from the Greetery, their reflection stamp set, and then I've got the Spellbinders Arches die set, and then that is the Woodland wreath from Spellbinders. I had a bunch of those cut, and I just trimmed them away to create some branches. And then here I'm showing you to use some multi-purpose adhesive, spray adhesive for these backgrounds, for these skins. Just a nice even coat is all you need. It doesn't need to be a ton. And here I messed up. I did not put any adhesive on the back of that white, that's why I'm putting it together like this, is because I realized I don't have any adhesive on the back of that white arch. And you're going to see how strong this stuff is, because it holds, the skin holds that white arch onto that navy arch beautifully. Holds it there. It doesn't come off. I'm trying to get it lined up, because I know once I get one piece stuck down, I'm not going to be able to move that arch around. So I'm gently tapping, because again, it's still delicate, even though we have that spray adhesive on there. And then I'm going to get a block here in a second to really adhere that down and smush it down, but keep my fingers out of any loose adhesive that may be on my fingers from picking it up and spraying and manipulating it. Because, you know, spray adhesive goes everywhere, and have an open window. You don't want to be inhaling spray adhesive. So this is an A2 size card. So I've got some white cardstock, and then I use some spray adhesive on this thin arch that I die cut with those arch dies. And so I've got a couple tweezers, because the adhesive is strong. It sticks to those tweezers, and then a little bone folder to adhere that down. And then some on-point glue just to start adding on my branches. I will say, for the delicateness of these skins, you definitely want a spray adhesive. Doesn't have to be the Scotch that I used, but you need a spray glue, spray adhesive. Don't use like your repositionable stencil sprays, because that's not a long-term adhesive. And so now I'm just piecing everything together. And the white cardstock I used is just 120-pound accent opaque, so nice sturdy cardstock. And then for the sentiment strip, I did the same. So I just had a sentiment strip laying around that fit this particular stamp, and used some Twilight, VersaFine Clear Twilight to do my stamping in. And that is going to wrap up the cards, my friends. Backgrounds, skins, whatever you want to call them. That's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Be sure and check the description box below to see all the products used in today's video. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll catch you in the next video.